Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Zoom and for watching us live on social media. My name is Kadir Üstün. I'm the Executive Director at the Sirte Foundation at Washington, D.C. Today, we are hosting a panel of experts to discuss the most recent developments in Libya. Our event is titled Shifting Dynamics Toward a New Era in Libya? ? As many of you might be following, the conflict in Libya has recently developed in a recent new direction with the retreat of General Haftar's forces from Tripoli and the government of national accords recent advances towards the key city of Sirte. The dynamics on the ground appear to be shifting in favor of Libya's UN-recognized government. And Turkey and the GNA recently declined an offer by Egyptian proposed ceasefire that attests to the GNA's momentum as well. Regional politics continue to shape the situation in Libya. Even after the retreat of mercenary groups, Russia has signaled its willingness to support Haftar's forces by relocating more combat aircraft to eastern Libya. Turkey continues to show its support for the government in Tripoli. The EU appears divided, with Italy on the side of GNA, for instance, while France appears to side with Haftar. As such, the ongoing conflict has implications for the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. The US has largely been absent from the conflict in Libya, but the readout of a recent phone call between President Erdogan and President Trump mentioned certain agreements between the US and Turkey. So the conflict has implications for the US-Turkey relationship as well. To discuss these dynamics and what's happening in Libya, we have Dr. Muhittin Ataman. He's the Director of Foreign Policy Program at the Sirte Foundation, joining us from Ankara. He's the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed academic journal Inside Turkey. Dr. Ataman also teaches at Ankara Social Sciences University, and his research covers Turkish foreign policy, the Middle East, and the Gulf politics. He'll be commenting on Turkey's Libya policy and the Turkish support for the UN-recognized GNA government. In fact, a high-level Turkish delegation has arrived in Libya just today, so we look forward to Dr. Ataman's comments about that as well. We also have Dr. Silvia Colombo. She's the head of Italy's foreign policy program at Istituto Affari Internazionali. I don't know if I said it correctly, but joining us from Rome. She's a senior fellow in the Mediterranean and the Middle East program and an expert on Middle Eastern politics. She works on Euro-Mediterranean cooperation, transatlantic relations in the Mediterranean, and domestic and regional politics in the Arab world. Dr. Colombo will be speaking to us about Italy's Libya policy, as well as that of the EU. There are some major disagreements, as I mentioned, between European countries, like France and Italy, so I look forward to her analysis of the intra-European policy differences as well. We were supposed to have Tim Eaton of Chatham House joining us from London today, but he won't be able to join us due to a family emergency, so we apologize for that. We will start with our panelists' introductory remarks, and then I'll ask a few questions before we open it to questions from our Zoom and social media audiences. If you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat box to ask your questions. We'll try to make sure we answer all questions. Again, thank you all for joining us, and without further ado, I want to turn to Dr. Ataman for his introductory remarks about Turkey and Turkey's Libya policy. Dr. Ataman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, Kadir, thank you very much for giving this opportunity to me to explain the position of Turkey towards Libya. I will try to focus on two different points. The first one is, yes, there are shifting dynamics in the Libyan crisis. The turning point followed by, after two significant developments between Turkey and Libya. The first one is the signing of two memoranda between Turkey and the legitimate government of Libya, that is the government of the National Accord, on November 27 of the last year. One of these memorandum was about the delimitation of maritime jurisdictions in the Eastern Mediterranean between the two countries. The second one was about cooperation in security and defense between the two countries. The second significant development based on the signed memorandum between the two actors was the deployment of Turkish soldiers in Libya on January the 2nd of this year, and the start of the Operation Volcano of Rage. So these two developments forced the realities to change on the ground. The second thing that I want to focus on is on the main objectives of Turkey. What are the main objectives, targets of Turkey in Libya? I will try to explain briefly at two different levels. The first one is at the national level. At the national level, the first objective, this can be considered as three different stages at the same time. That is three main objectives and three main stages of the crisis. At the first stage, the main objective of Turkey was to protect the GNA and to keep it as an actor in Libya. Therefore, Turkey defended the capital city of Tripoli. This objective was achieved, by the way, so far as we all witness. At the second stage, Turkey attempted to throw back Haftar forces and clear them from the western sectors of the country, which they did for the last 2 months. I mean, from most of the western sectors of the country, and to make the GNA as the main actor, if possible, the only actor of Libya on the negotiation table, and to spread the authority of the GNA to all over the country. Especially nowadays, the main objective is, in this sense, to control the city of Sirte, Jufra, and the Oil Crescent, in order to be able to claim a real authority on the half of the country, at least. At the third stage, the Turkish objective is to achieve and protect political unity, political integration of the country, and at the same time, following this one, to achieve the reconstruction of the state. This is one of the main targets of Turkey. And I believe that today's visit is exactly about this last point. That's why today's visit can be considered as the third main development which will create a change, a comprehensive change on the ground. So when we look at the regional level, we see that Turkey has two main objectives. The first one is Turkey is against the creation of fait accompli in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was created, unfortunately, by some of the regional countries led by Israel, Egypt, and Greece. So Turkey felt contained by this development, especially after the intervention of the Russian Federation. So for Turkey, there was no other chance but to break the balance, to change the balance of power in the region, and to sign this memorandum with the Libyan government. So the second main objective of Turkey is to defend one of the democratic fronts of the Arab Spring. You know, at the regional level, we know that the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia has been trying to to transform the so-called Arab Spring into the so-called Arab winter. That is to transform all democratic, fragile, we know that incomplete democratic structures into hardcore despotic authoritarian regimes as they did it in Egypt. And they want to do this in Libya, in Tunisia, especially one of the most successful cases of the Arab Spring. So Turkey considers Libya as one of the main fronts to challenge these anti-Turkish forces and their attempts of containment in the region. And that's why Turkey wants to keep this, at least we know that the GNA representatives were mainly elected by the Libyan people, after the election made in 2013. And as a continuation of this one, by the way, Turkey wants to limit the spread of the Russian force, the Russian power, and the Russian power in the Eastern Mediterranean. As a matter of fact, Turkey, and as a political scientist from Turkey, I see this in the midterm and long term as a bigger challenge to Europe. That is, NATO and the European countries has to face this threat from the south. When we talk about Russia, most people naturally consider this as an Eastern threat. That's why NATO has been piling up all of its powers, or most of its powers, in the Central and Eastern European countries. And in the long run, I think it will be a bigger threat, that is to control the Eastern and Central Mediterranean region. So Turkey, as a NATO member, and as a country which has the largest shores in the Eastern Mediterranean, it feels threatened by these possible developments, and it wants to take some preventive actions. And the Libyan front gives some chances, opportunities to Turkey to achieve this objective. And I will keep it short, and at this point, then I'm open to further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ataman, for those remarks. Sylvia, we want to turn to you now for your initial remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, good morning to everyone. Thank you to Sita for this kind invitation. I would like to start, before delving into the role of Italy and the broader role of the European Union into the Libyan conflict, with some initial few points on how I see the situation in Libya itself developing, because I think it's very difficult to disentangle the two sides, the internal and the external. Of course, it's a proxy war with many players involved. And sometimes one of the risks I see is to look at Libya, and this is the case for other conflicts as well, from external lenses only, without paying enough attention to internal development. So we know very well, as you rightly said, Kadir, that a tremendous shift has happened in the past few weeks in Libya, which is Haftar's defeat. And we can really call it like this because, first of all, it was not expected, but it turned out to be a much more, a much more evident defeat than the initial. Some initial portraits, some initial descriptions wanted to make of it. This defeat is having and is likely to have a huge impact on the internal dynamics in the country. On both sides, on both camps. And of course, it's important to look at both of them individually. First of all, the coalitions are very fluid at the moment. The groups, the two sides are very fluid at the moment. First of all, this has always been the case to some extent because Libya has a very complex societal political landscape, I would say, made of informal groups, tribes, allegiances, and so on and so forth. But at this specific moment in time, these alliances or coalitions are even more fluid because of what's happened with Haftar's attempt to push for the conquest of Tripoli. Of course, this restructuring of the alliances is not leading to a clear definition at the moment, so it will play out with time, and we don't know what the consequences will be. What we see, for example, in Haftar's coalition or Haftar side is that it's really falling apart. So in the east, which is Haftar's former stronghold, you see really a deterioration, a questioning of Haftar's role, military role, first of all, because lots of people, lots of groups had bet onto Haftar's because of his military power and attempted to conquer by military power the whole country. Some people are even questioning that this was the right approach from the very beginning, and so they are even saying that okay, this was a huge mistake from the beginning, and taking a distance from Haftar, particularly those that had a, so to say, an opportunistic allegiance to Haftar. Those mercenaries, those militaries that were brought into the conflict without a clear motivation. And this also applies, for example, to some parts in the south of the country. Others instead think that Haftar did the right thing in waging his assault to Tripoli, but are starting also to claim that since we have seen such a tremendous shift, probably Libya is not going to remain one unitary country, that it's impossible for the two sides either one winning over the other or to live together. And so there are more and more separatist or federal voices from the political level that are advancing in the country, particularly in the east, which has always suffered from a sort of fatigue and kind of conflictuality with the West, also in terms of its position in the overall Libyan landscape. And so Haftar is really facing a difficult moment, and much of his fate, militarily, but above all politically, will really depend on how the external backers of Haftar, in particular Egypt, the UAE, and Russia itself, will what kind of support they will give to Haftar. On the other side, we see an equally fluid situation, I would say, because, of course, we talk about the government of national accord, but we know from the very beginning that this government and the leadership of Sarraj has never been a unified entity. There was a strong anti-Haftar sentiment, which grew over time, particularly since last year when in April the assault began. But this anti-Haftar sentiment has never translated into a pro-GNA or pro-Sarraj sentiment. So even in that case, in the West, the coalition, if we want to call it like this, is falling apart. We know with Misurata and other towns that are claiming also their rights to be more autonomous from Tripoli to some extent. This criticism and anti-GNA sentiment is also bred by all the corruption that unfortunately has always characterized the Libyan state to some extent, and also a daunting crisis, an economic crisis, to which the Tripoli government has not been able to put to find a solution to. So there is a huge problem, as we know, of local governance, the articulation of the structure of the state, and this has increased the economic problems. Libyan society is increasingly divided on both sides, and this has, of course, a repercussion on the role of the external players. And so coming to my particular focus on the EU, of course, Turkey and Russia are now at the center stage, and their support, their role will change because of the shifts in the coalitions in the two sides, which I tried to describe, because their leverage will change because of the fact that the GNA on the one hand and the Haftar's camp are falling apart. But it's undoubtless that they call the shots. I mean, Turkey and Russia have been able to put their footprint onto the country, onto the future of the country, and they have completely sidelined those players, external players, that used to be or tried to be active player in Libya. And of course, geography has a role there, and of course, European countries, the EU itself, but particularly some member states, and I'm referring to, of course, to Italy and France in particular, due to the geography and the historical connections to Libya, have always attempted since 2011, and that's kind of, but even from before that, but from the beginning of this first round of conflict, we have seen an attempt to manage kind of the situation in Libya and to acquire a proactive role in this conflict. Italy's position is very clear in the sense that it's built on historical connections and a level of deep knowledge we have as Italians at the policy making level, at the intelligence level, but also at the people-to-people level among the two sides, Italian and Libyan. But Italy alone knows that it cannot do much, and so it has always tried to develop its Libya policy in the framework of the EU's policy. And so it's not possible to disentangle the two sides. Of course, Italy has also tried to pursue its own autonomous kind of foreign policy, national interests. In the case of Libya, we have an important energy interest in the form of energy resources. I mean, the role of Eni, our national oil company, that is even sometimes perceived as a Libyan actor, although it's actually an external actor that has an established presence in the country, has never left the country. Italy is the only European country that has continued to have an embassy open during all the stages of the conflict. And through this embassy and through the personnel that works on Libya, both in Rome and on the ground, we have really tried to cultivate this very direct relations. Of course, this has been perceived as too much by some of our European partners, and we have found ourselves in a very open disagreement and conflict with France in particular, because of two different understandings of the situation, out as a result of the political culture, first of all, of the two countries, of the two intelligence services, and all the policymaking board both in Paris and in Rome. Italy made from the very beginning a quite direct and open choice of supporting the GNA, the Government of National Accord, which is internationally recognized, and has tried to push in the direction of reinforcing and strengthening this government in the framework of the European Union's policies towards Libya, which in their turn are based on what the UN does, because in terms of the political action, diplomatic action, and support to the negotiation, the EU itself has not played a direct role. It all builds its role, so to say, onto what the UN does. So the political dialogue and the negotiation that was until the entry into the picture of Turkey and Russia as the main kind of mediating player in the case of the Libyan conflict. So Italy is building, has made this choice. France, on the other hand, as we know very well, has chosen to support the other side, both formally and informally, in the sense that there are many instances in which France over the years has claimed to support and to be kind of in line with the broader European position in favor of, which is in favor of the GNA. But we know that behind the doors, not so behind, quite openly, actually, France has pursued the policy that has tried to prop up Haftar and his side. Of course, this has intertwined with some very problematic, I would say, intra-European dynamics of competition and conflict against the backdrop of a foreign and security policy of the EU, which is still not well developed. The competition between France and Italy could have been actually a positive stimulus for the EU to develop and build its foreign policy on the basis of the added value of the different countries. But in the end, what this competition created was a sort of stumbling block onto the broader European framework towards Libya. At the same time, as I said, it's also a question of domestic audiences, domestic politics in both countries at a very crucial moment. And I think that the most acute phase of the competition, and it's not by surprise, was in 2018 and the beginning of 2019, when we in Italy had a government which was very anti-France, anti-Europe government, with the Lega party in power next to the populist five-star movement. And so things have changed to some extent in Italy vis-à-vis France, vis-à-vis Libya itself, with the coming to power of the current government in August. And I had the chance to look at some data from a recent survey on the Italian public opinion with regard to the foreign policy, how the population see the foreign policy of the current government. And Libya and the management of the Libyan crisis, which is very much tied to the management of migration, appears to be in more favorable viewpoints in this government than in the previous one. So what I'm trying to say is that although it seemed during the previous government, which had this connotation of being anti-European, anti-migration, Libya, I would say, because the solutions that were put on the table to try to solve the Libyan problems were completely wrong from my viewpoint. Although that government seemed to have quite a big support, it turns out now that actually it did create a lot of damages on the one hand, and also that we are luckily been able to overcome this phase and to develop a better coordination also in the case of France. So what happened? It's not just because the government in Italy has changed its colors. It's not because France has changed sides. Libya has, of course, become more sidelined, has been sidelined in the foreign policy of the two countries because of the lack of the European framework. And the lack of the European framework is what has opened the door to Turkey and Russia to step in at the end of 2019. And let's be very, very frank. But this lack of European framework has been dragging on for many years. And so it's kind of something that has been in the making for some time. The EU has tried to make some attempts to make up for this lack of common foreign policy, but it's been taken hostage to some extent of the Italian-French conflict and the competition. So what has changed, I think, is also the emergence of Germany as in the position of leadership, renewed leadership, both within the European project, also in economic terms, particularly in this very recent moment fighting the coronavirus emergency, but also in foreign policy. So Germany made, towards the end of 2019, an attempt to push itself out from the sort of neutral and quite low motion foreign policy that had characterized German foreign policy making for quite some time. It pushed for example, for the Berlin conference, which is still, to some extent, is still providing the overall framework for any kind of negotiations. It seems that Turkey and Russia, for example, are also moving into the kind of the continuation of the Berlin process, of the Berlin conference that was kicked off in mid-January this year. And so having Germany in the steering seat has been helpful for France and Italy to try to mend a little bit their relationship. What this all means for the EU and for its policy towards Libya, I think we are still quite far from the development of a fully fledged, autonomous and active foreign policy vis-à-vis Libya. There are still many stumbling blocks. One of the signs and the proofs of this is the fact that the latest naval mission that has been decided and agreed upon by the European member states, the Irini mission, that takes over the UNAVFOR Med Sofia maritime military mission, is really some people define it a fiction. Is something that has been voted and has been agreed upon as a really minimum common denominator, just to show that Europe is not completely absent, but has been criticized very vigorously, both by the Libyans themselves, because I mean it was not really requested. And on the other side, of course, the member states still think that it will not achieve anything, and so they are not ready to put and to enforce it in a meaningful way. So this is the kind of the story, the whole story of Europeans' foreign policy kind of deficiencies and obstacles that have proved very dangerous and very problematic in the case of Libya. And of course, there are many parallels with other cases, not just in the Mediterranean, but particularly in this very important strategic space for Europe. One of which is, of course, Syria, where you see a script going on which mirrors to some extent, or actually Libyan file mirrors the Syrian file. And so we might ask ourselves what lessons can we learn from the Syrian situation and conflict, how it has been dealt with by different external players that we cannot and should not repeat in the case of Libya. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for that comprehensive perspective on EU policy, but also for things on the ground. Maybe before let me ask you my question, but wait for your answer. So I go back to Dr. Ataman. I wanted to ask you, when you talked about the fragmentation on the ground, and there are all these alliances, and you made a very strong comment about Libya won't stay as one country. We know what happened with other nation building projects in the Middle East. Do you see any path towards Libya staying one country, one nation, if GNA is successful somehow, both militarily but politically as well? Do you see a path, or you feel like given the involvement of so many outside actors, it's just not going to be possible, but it's going to be more fragmented under the influence of different powers? Dr. Ataman, let me ask you my question about this recent offer by Egypt for ceasefire, and Turkey, as you know, declined that. And GNA declined it, obviously, and for understandable reasons, I guess. They have the momentum on their side. But were there other things that prevented Turkey and GNA from accepting that offer? Why did they decline it? And my second part of that question is who Turkey is working with in Libya. We've seen Sylvia indicated that Turkey and Russia have become the main actors there, but are there Turkey's other partners on the ground in Libya?
Okay, thank you very much, Kadir, for the question. Let me say that the record of Haftar is the biggest reason of the decline of the ceasefire, the declaration of the ceasefire by Haftar and Egypt. Because so far, Haftar and his external backers have been trying to solve the problem through military means only. They were dedicated to the control of the whole country. He declared himself as the only representative of the Libyan state and Libyan nations. He is the one who did not abide by the declaration of ceasefires in Moscow, in the Sohayrat political agreement, in Berlin, in Rome. You know, he is the one who left the first all international platforms. So the biggest reason is his insistence on military means, using military means, with considering no red line. You know, he targeted, as we all know, the civilians, hospitals, civilian areas, etc. So the second one is one of his main backers, that is the United Arab Emirates, and with its influence, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they are not in favor of diplomatic negotiations either. So together with all this, naturally, the GNA, they do not trust Haftar, and they do not trust his external backers. Okay, when it comes to the Turkish position, I think there is no alliance on the Turkish side, unfortunately. We see that diplomatically, it's the United Nations and many other international platforms, they declare the GNA as the only legitimate actor of the Libyan state and the Libyan people. But when it comes to the ground, unfortunately, there is no real support to Turkey. That is, Turkey remains so far as the only real, vital, and meaningful support for the GNA. You know, even Italy, you know, diplomatically, Italy supports Turkey, supports GNA, that is Turkish efforts. But unlike Egypt and unlike Greece, they are not on the ground. You know, even Germany, you know, it's a kind of in between, you know, mainly supporting diplomatic, at least in its political discourse, it supports the GNA, but nobody is on the ground, unlike the United Arab Emirates, unlike Russia, France, etc. So I believe Turkey is the only real backer of the GNA, unfortunately.
Dr. Ataman, actually, you answered two questions from the audience. They were asking about the potential for Turkey and Libya to work together, cooperate on Libya. What are the chances of that? And what are the kind of interests, overlapping interests Italy and Turkey might have that would kind of allow and foster that cooperation? These questions were directed to both of you. So Sylvia, you can prepare to answer for that as well. Dr. Ataman, go ahead, please.
Okay, I think, you know, in the context of the EU, we see a polarization when it comes to the Libyan crisis. We see on the one hand, we have Italy, I mean, which has been supporting the GNA. On the other hand, we have two strictly Haftar supporters, that is Greece and France. So to me, there is an overlap of interest in Libya for Turkey and Italy. So, you know, when it comes to the, for instance, to the oil sector, we know that the Italian companies are mainly compete with the French companies. So Turkey, in this case, can provide an atmosphere for the Italian companies, that is the GNA, as the GNA backers, to take benefit of the of the Libyan oil sector. So, and diplomatically also, both economically and diplomatically, politically, I see there is an overlap for the two countries.
Thank you, Dr. Ataman. Sylvia, maybe you can comment on this Italy-Turkey question first before going back to my original question about nation building.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, Turkey and Italy, they do, of course, share a lot of common interests in the case of Libya, but I would say that while Italy has its own kind of set of partners in the country, particularly in the western part, in the GNA, on the GNA side, and is very afraid of losing its ground, its connections, and so would not welcome too abrupt shifts in the kind of in the structure of power, so to say, of the GNA or of the sides that Italy is more involved with. On the other side, it seems that Turkey is trying really to build these new connections and to exploit them, particularly for economic reasons, which is totally understandable. And as the previous speaker mentioned, it all boils down and goes back to the memorandum of understandings that were signed by the GNA and Turkey in November last year. So I don't think that Italy would have a problem in kind of sharing its economic activities or Libya's economic activities with Turkey, but here I think that the problem is not really. I mean, it's not to jump to this economic aspect too quickly before having settled, I would say, the political situation and the divisions that persist across the country. So we cannot expect that the divisions will go away just because one side, which is Haftar's side, is losing ground tremendously. We know that the Libya will remain a fractured country, a very divided country, in which the economy will continue to play a negative role to some extent, because one side risks feeling kind of marginalized if we focus too much and exclusively on the Western side, which is the case of Turkey and Italy for the moment. So it's probably preferable now to start a conversation with those external players, UAE in particular, but and also Egypt in particular, I would say. So how to bring in the other side as well, and what kind of facilitation we can provide it to unify the country again and to heal some of its problems, which are very much linked to the societal divisions and the political fractures that have grown over the years. And so I would say that Italy could have some cards in reaching out to Egypt, for example, at the moment, since Egypt sits on the other side, let's say, of the divide, and to try to engage with Egypt, and both of them as middle-sized powers in this kind of big conflict, where you see Turkey, which is a big size, Russia is a big size, of course. Italy and Egypt, on the other side, could play this kind of open some breakdown, open some have some groundbreaking role in trying to open a new period of negotiations, for example, after this heightened conflictual phase. And this is also linked to your question, Kadir, about the fragmentation of the country on the ground, which has been growing to the point that, as I was referring to, some people, some constituencies here and there, particularly, for example, some businessmen who from eastern Libya had fled to the west, and now they're coming back with the consciousness that after 1 year of conflict, it's very difficult for the two sides to heal the wounds and for them to continue their business or to remain united. And so there is this federalist discourse of a division, a partition of Libya, which is growing day after day. So a kind of discourse, we are not so fit to live together, and so what? I think that Libya has been confronted with this issue, with this problem, with this question many times before. I remember even in 2011, immediately after the fall of Gaddafi, that there was this question: will Libya remain a united country? And of course, the answer of the Libyans has always been yes. We are a united country despite all our history. I think that what preoccupies the most, I mean, what is slightly changing now is that the fatigue after almost 10 years of conflict, and the fact that the politicians on both sides have completely lost the trust of the population, are pushing some people to question whether there is de facto a partition of the country, or it could be a potential solution. I don't think it will be any solution to the conflict, and more importantly, I don't think that Turkey and Russia would accept this solution. They are in one way or another struggling and kind of coming to terms with one another in order to keep the country united. A sort of division of labor, division of spheres of influence, so fragmentation, as you rightly said, without coming to this very drastic solution.
Thank you, Sylvia. We have quite a few questions, and for the sake of time, I want to go through them before I ask more questions and take more time. And I'll want short answers if possible. Thank you so much. I think this has been so far very comprehensive and great, explaining all the different dynamics, both internally and externally. Dr. Ataman, a question is on Russia. Is there an agreement, possibility for an agreement between Turkey and Russia? What are major conflicting views? Would it be acceptable to Russia, for instance, GNA reaches and controls the oil crescent and Al Jafra base taken away from Haftar, for instance? Yes, go ahead.
Okay. We can make a comparison for the Russian state, comparison of the Libyan crisis and the Syrian crisis. When we look at the Syrian crisis, we see that the Russian state officially is there, and it has been backing, supporting the Assad regime, especially since 2015. And it officially declares that he has been supporting the Assad regime. But when it comes to Libya, the Russian state does not want to declare that it is in the Libyan crisis. It intervenes the Libyan crisis officially as a state. Therefore, for instance, it sent a private military companies, Wagner, to send its mercenaries to there. It painted its aircrafts not to be seen as the official Russian aircrafts. That is, Russia is there indirectly. So the meaning of the Libyan crisis is not the same as the meaning of the Syrian state for Russia. But still, I think there is no chance. It seems that at least for the short term, no way for Turkey and Russia to reach an agreement in the Libyan crisis. We see that they are still there. They are still in the eastern part of the country. They keep their mercenaries there. They keep, as it was declared by the United States military officials, around 2,000 mercenaries are still stationed in the eastern part of the country. On the other hand, there are a kind of a dozen of Russian aircrafts still stationed in the eastern part of Turkey and are ready for the use by the Haftar side.
Eastern part of Libya, you meant?
Yes, the eastern part of Libya, sorry. Looking from the Turkish side, and Turkey, values attach a great importance to the maintenance, to the protection of the GNA government in Libya. Otherwise, as I've mentioned earlier, it will be quite harmful for both bilateral relations and the regional setting, the regional balance of power. So Turkey cannot take some steps back vis-a-vis the Libyan crisis. So I see no agreement, at least for the foreseeable future.
Another question is on Egypt. Would you say it's the same thing with Egypt? Because the question says East exclusive economic zone actually agreement between Libya and Turkey actually works for the benefit of Egypt. So do you see that as a potential rapprochement possibility out of that overlapping interest, or you think it's the same dynamic with Russia?
I think the Egyptian case is quite different. The Egyptian government, this is how I see it at least, they have been following the footsteps of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, for many reasons, because of their backing the military coup in 2013. So in one sense, Sisi owes his authority, his government to these two states. They were the main backers, and they are still supporting the Egyptian government financially. Unfortunately, it is quite ironic, by the way, to see one of the two heavyweight Arab powers, which is Saudi Arabia and Egypt, becoming the tail of the Emiratis. So it's quite shameful for the Egyptian government to act in this way. I think my interpretation, Turkey is quite ready to initiate a rapprochement with the Egyptian government. But one of the preconditions is not to follow the pro-Emirati policies in the region overall. So if Sisi government is ready to follow a more independent regional policy, I think Turkey is ready to initiate this rapprochement process. As it is mentioned in the question, signing the economic exclusive zone, they have reached an agreement with the Greek Cypriots, which was unfavor of them. And the agreement signed with Libya, between Libya and the Turkish government, naturally is in favor of Egypt. But again, ironically, the Egyptian government insistently rejects this and against its own interest, unfortunately. So I see a possibility of rapprochement between Egypt and Turkey.
But it's going to be difficult, you're saying.
It will take time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Sylvia, there is actually, I want to combine three questions. I think they're all interrelated. One is about US-Russia potentially coming to an agreement on the Libyan issue. The other one is on the UN Security Council. Does the Security Council have a role to play? And of course, EU's role in Security Council regarding the situation in Libya. And then there's also a specific question about the US. Why is US hindering the process of appointing a special envoy of UN to Libya to replace Ghassan Salama? So sort of, UN, EU, we know often aligns with the UN Security Council resolution. Has there been any movement there diplomatically? I haven't seen much. Sorry, I'm adding more to this, but I was going to ask you about NATO, right? You talked about EU's, foreign policy not being clear, and it's kind of there are internal disagreements between France and Italy, etc. How about the NATO angle? I was going to say. So I'm throwing quite a few things at you, but how do you see US role, UN, and then NATO, these multinational organizations having an impact on the situation or having a say in the situation in Libya?
Well, thank you very much. These are very, difficult questions, and I'm not sure I have all the answers. Of course, I will just say a few words because they are all interrelated. Of course, we are talking about the external powers who, as part of different multilateral fora, used to have the biggest role in managing conflicts and solving conflicts until recently. But we know that globally now conflict resolution has been taking different shapes and different formats recently. And so we have a crisis of trust and the deterioration of the role of the United Nations and in particular the Security Council within it, because it's totally blocked. I mean, the problem with the Security Council and the UN at large is the fact that its ability really to put forth a solution that are or actions that are binding for its members, and that could really make a breakthrough in the conflict situations is really limited because of the particularly US-Russia conflict at some points, but also I would say that the US-China conflict, which is not directly linked to the Libyan conflict itself, because I mean, but globally, of course, it does create a burden onto the UN ability, and particularly the Security Council's ability to play a role there. So there is a host of problems with the UN, which we all know, but I think that the current US-China conflict that, as I said, goes much in broader terms, is what is putting a lid onto the performance of this crucial institution. And then, of course, on the European side, our performance also within the UN and the conflicts that you see on the European side also get translated at the UN level, although luckily at the UN level we have been able in recent years to try to muster a more united European position, which is again is a very limited common denominator, minimum common denominator position of the European countries, which is not going to make any breakthrough. But there is a broader question, or a question in the background that's I think has an impact on all of this. What is the US policy vis-a-vis Libya, if any? I mean, can we say that the US is interested in Libya, is willing to play a role, is has the potential to do that, or is totally taken by other stuff? It seems that the US is not really there. It's really looking from kind of from behind the curtains, and so. Before talking about the possibility of US-Russia coordination, it's really important to think of what the US wants to achieve in the case of Libya. It sees as any role for itself. What I see in the case of the US is that in one way or another, they are not going to get involved in this conflict. They didn't do that during the most tense phase of the conflict, which is the year that is just behind us, and they are not going to do that. They are looking at how Russia is positioning itself, of course, and let's not forget that Russia is supporting the same side as the UAE and Egypt, which are US allies in clear ways, and Russia knows this very well. So in one way or another, the US is present in the conflict, I think, because I mean, behind the UAE and behind Egypt's policies vis-a-vis Libya, there is some level of information coordination with the US. I would say, particularly and for sure when it comes to Egypt, but I would say also of the Emirati, say the same thing of the Emirati for obvious reasons, because of the importance of the Gulf dimension of the US foreign policy in the Middle East in general. And coming to NATO, well, NATO, again, suffers from the same problems of the UN, which are even made more acute by the fact that Turkey, a NATO member, is a part of this conflict. At the same time, there is, of course, the tensions on the European soil with the Cypriot issue. So it's really trying to remain outside of Libya, also because I don't think that time is ripe for NATO to go back to Libya in any form after what happened in 2011, because among Libyans themselves, NATO's intervention is not necessarily seen in good eyes. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sylvia. Dr. Ataman, very quickly, there's a question. There are two questions on France and Turkey. Basically, are there overlapping interests between the two countries, and the current war of words between France and Turkey How is that going to evolve? Very quickly, you have
Okay.
30 seconds to a minute at most.
30,
Thank you.
okay, okay. That's fine. There is no overlap, unfortunately, between Turkey and France in the Libyan crisis. Last week, the French officials, they have declared Turkey as an aggressor in the Libyan crisis. And unfortunately, you know, this claim was made by a NATO ally who has been supporting General Haftar, whose main backer is Russia. Okay, so I see quite ironic when the United States has been supporting other Arab countries supporting Haftar. That means indirectly the United States has been supporting the Russian actor, not an American proxy or actor on the ground. And one last thing, you know, the image of Turkey is very negative in France. They have been anti-Turkish in the Syrian crisis, and they have been working, as we all know, they were buying and having transactions with ISIS and other violent non-state actors, but still they continue blaming Turkey for supporting a legitimate government in Libya. The decision which was made by France itself, that is, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, they have supported the decision. But when it comes to Turkey, I think most of the Western countries, including the United States, they do not want Libya to be put under the control or influence of Turkey. So that's why they have a dilemma in the Libyan crisis.
Dr. Ataman, as I mentioned at the beginning, just 2 days ago, President Erdogan spoke to President Trump on the phone, and they said that, quote unquote, they reached certain agreements, but it wasn't clear on Libya. So on the one hand, there's the U.S. policy aligned with Russia and Egypt and UAE, but Erdogan and Trump seem to have some sort of dialogue, at least, about this.
I think recently it has begun to change. I mean, the U.S. perspective, U.S. policy, it has been changing.
All right. One last thing, Sylvia. Why is, I guess the age-old question, why the EU cannot achieve consensus on Libya? I think you've already answered that question, but if you have anything to add, is that because of COVID that's causing the discord among the EU members, or other things? That's the question.
Well, I think that there are a series of reasons, but on the one hand, the EU has faced the Libyan crisis as its first crucial test to its common foreign policy in 2011 when the crisis broke out. It was like the second year of having a common foreign security policy in the form of the European External Action Service that was meant to really develop this new set of actions in the foreign policy of the EU. So it was taken by surprise, and it was not prepared to do that at the moment. Didn't have the instruments, didn't have the kind of the political willingness also to create a common ground among its members. I mean, I think that the other part of the reason is, of course, with the member states themselves. Unless they decided to leave some space for foreign policy to the EU, common position or common policies, the EU will not ever make it to play any meaningful role. Of course, as I said at the beginning, differences and differences of views among member states can also be positive things, provided that there is a common framework under which they can be kind of reconciled and put as a common factor in a positive way. In the case of Libya, France and Italy have not behaved like this for, as I tried to say, also for the domestic reasons and linked to politics, links to the very poisoned atmosphere around the issue of migration at a crucial moment for the political life of these two countries. Let's hope that with the new set of European institutions also coming out from the pandemic with a renewed sense of being part and being all on the same boat, might push the EU towards also a new season in its common foreign security policy, also in the case of Libya.
Thank you very much. Silvia Colombo from Rome, Dr. Muhittin Ataman from Ankara. I think this has been such an in-depth, comprehensive discussion, and I want to thank you for explaining all the complexities of the conflict, both internally, domestically, but also regionally, explaining to our audience what is at stake and what are the dynamics ongoing. And I think if you've taken anything away from this discussion, it's going to continue to be complex and messy, and we're going to probably hear more and more about Libya with all the sort of diverging interests of regional actors as well as global actors. So I want to ask my audience to virtually thank our panelists for this great discussion. Thank you very much. We will hope to see you in future discussions again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.